by acknowledging that Wilfrid Laurier University and its campuses are located on the Haldeman Tract, the traditional territory of the neutral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples. Today, this gathering place is home to many First Nations, Métis, and Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island. Acknowledging them reminds us of our important connection to this land where we live, learn, work, and play. We recognize, honor, and respect these nations as the traditional stewards of the land upon which Laurier is present. And as a reminder of our duty to protect these precious lands, on my desk, I keep this sculpture of a turtle that was given to me by the Six Nations community nearby. And as a reminder of our duty to protect our children, I continuously refer to this card that was given to me by a Métis community in Manitoba. It states, "Is it good for our children?" That very question will guide our thoughts and our discussions today. If we had $1 billion, what would we do that's good for our children in the province of Ontario? I'd like to express my sincere gratitude to the Laurier Centre for Leading Research in Education, affectionately known as CLRiE, and especially to Dr. Kelly Gallagher-McKay for gathering such an impressive panel of influential professionals in the field of education. I recognize many names and colleagues. Many thanks to Dr. Steve Sider, who is the director of CLRiE and a faculty member of the Faculty of Education, to the members of CLRiE who are here today, and to Kathleen Leese, staff coordinator, for all of their tireless efforts to research, to mobilize, and to amplify these critical issues in education that we'll be discussing. Laurier Faculty of Education is very appreciative to all of our distinguished guests for your time, your passion, and your commitment. And we are looking forward to working with you and CLRiE members to develop authentic actions to make Ontario a more equitable, safe, and engaging learning environment for all children. And on a side note, I'd like to also mention that I first met Annie Kidder in about the year 2000 when I was on a panel with Annie, and she's the moderator for today's event. At the time, she was representing People for Education, and I was a school board consultant. And since I had co-authored the kindergarten program, the Ministry of Education had asked me to represent them. Needless to say, I was very nervous to be on the same panel as Annie Kidder, representing the Ministry of Education, but it went well. And today we have Annie here again. So I'm very grateful for her presence, and I'll now pass it on to Kelly to continue with the program. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Maria. It's great to see everybody here today, and I'm so grateful to all of you for joining us on such short notice, knowing how much everyone is juggling. We're thrilled to have such a cross-section of educational leaders and outstanding researchers brought together with this shared concern about educational rebuilding in the wake of COVID-19. Our focus today is not so much on the disruptions and harms of COVID-19 or on the underlying inequalities they've revealed per se, but it's onto that question of now what? What steps does Ontario need to take to ensure that students who've borne such heavy burdens from the pandemic in terms of their educational, social, and well-being impacts, what do we do to ensure that these burdens don't turn into long-term harms, which are not only bad for students, but also bad for Canada? We need to think in terms of how do we act now in the educational space to recognize and address very, very serious educational issues that have been at the center of the pandemic and yet not at the center of public conversations about the pandemic. As we've talked, obviously with importance and urgency about what's required to keep schools open, We haven't talked about what do we need to make sure kids are okay in the long term. And so our conversation today is about that longer term picture, or I hope it is. Canada has been a laggard on educational recovery, maybe because we haven't been having these public conversations. Countries we normally think of as far from exemplary in the educational space. I think a disaster is a phrase I heard earlier this week, like the US and the UK, are now getting to be a couple of years into ambitious programs to address the educational harms of the pandemic. They've made investments that are 1 to 2 orders of magnitude beyond what we've seen in Canada. The Ontario budget for educational recovery, including special ed and mental health, is $79 million for a 2 million student system. That compares just slightly more than we've spent on cleaning products during the pandemic at $66 million. So it's time that we start to focus on the long-term educational and social outcomes and the kinds of supports that will support students in getting on a good trajectory for a future where they have lots of well-rounded skills and well-being, and that they're prepared for these uncertain future that we all face together. When we are talking about significant policy moves, and I think all of us are together because we believe we need significant policy moves, it's critical that the different stakeholders in the education system come together, talk together, agree and disagree together to think through what would work best for children and for the future of the province. And so our thought when we were talking about, well, how do you get a public conversation about educational recovery going, is that we should start with kind of an open hearing from a range of stakeholders and leading experts, a chance to hear from one another. And so we've designed today to do a couple of things very quickly. We're going to have everybody take no longer than I've just taken to talk about what you think are the biggest priorities for educational recovery and rebuilding. We're going to process all that. Annie is going to viciously time keep and minimally introduce us as we move through that progression. We'll take a 5-minute breather at the end of that because it's like an hour of straight listening, and I think people might need to stretch. And then in breakout groups, we've only got 3, each of which contains a cross-section of participants. We're going to process what we heard from each other and try and come out with what we think each group thinks is 3 key ideas for an educational recovery plan for Ontario. And in a plenary session, we're going to kind of brainstorm and put together what would be the bones of a policy proposal for real concrete action that would help make kids' situation better. We are delighted that Annie Kidder has agreed. She does not need an introduction in this group to keep us on time and on topic and enlivened and push us up a notch in various ways. So I'm going to turn the proceedings over to Annie now. And again, thank you all for coming.
Thank you, Kelly. So yes, my job in this part is really to remind you of the time. 2 minutes it's short, shorter than Kelly, but we need that big picture. What we're looking for is a pitch, basically, the critical evidence-based intervention that will best address the harms of this disruption in students' learning and well-being, and what do we need to do going forward. So there is, as you can see, a clock sitting there where you can watch it, and I will be watching it too. And I'm just going to introduce people in alphabetical order. So if you know your name is getting close, be ready to turn on your microphone. Thanks a lot, and thank you so much for having me. So the first person who's going to talk, because her name starts with A, is Kathy Abraham from the Ontario Public School Board, the head of the Ontario Public School Board Association. Thanks, Kathy.
Thank you, Annie. Sometimes having A as a last name is a good thing, sometimes not so much. Thanks very much for having me today to be part of this important discussion. I think we can all agree that the pandemic has brought new and unexpected challenges, but also exacerbated existing ones. And we simply can't go back to the way we were doing things. We need to challenge ourselves to reimagine what schools could become. So we've at OPSBA been researching and discussing this issue from some time with a wide range of stakeholders, many of whom are part of today's discussion. And we call our discussion paper Transitioning from the COVID-19 Experience. We also acknowledge that not everything is something that you can throw money at. We need to look at some systemic problems that we have, and that's a different discussion. But I'm going to emphasize just a big one for us right now that we're looking at. We have others. So for the findings of our work so far, that we need to make focus in the following area. Mental health supports. I often say this is like asking a child to do their homework when their house is on fire, and we need to be doing some work around this, and it's likely an issue for years to come. We need to focus excuse me, I got to change my pages here. We need to be focusing on 3 groups disproportionately impacted by COVID, those with pre-existing or escalating mental health concerns, and those who have been disconnected from school or marginally engaged during the pandemic. We must balance our curricular expectations with an integrated focus on mental health and well-being. Neither works without the other, and we need to understand that. We need more resources for mental health to ensure that all students have access to the level of support they need. There are some supports out there, but certainly not enough. And we need to be really looking at what it is that school boards need. And of course, student wellness is connected to adult wellness. Staff, parents, and guardians need time to recover and refresh from this pandemic too. And we won't have healthy adults in Canada or anywhere going forward if we don't have healthy students in our schools. And I've got 30 seconds. So we also need to really want to talk about the inequities in our society that we need to focus on outcomes and genuinely examine data that we can provide the necessary supports for all learners in our public system, which is the only system in which all students are welcome. Ooh, 9 seconds to spare.
Whoa, excellent job and great modeling as the first person. Fantastic. The next person is Keith Babayon. He is the president of the Ontario Secondary School Ontario Student Trustees Association. He's disappeared. Is he there? I just see a big clock right now.
Trying to find his tile.
Okay, he's trying to find. Maybe I'll go on to Shirley and come back to Keith. How about that?
Sounds great.
Okay, so the next person is Shirley Bell, who's the vice president of the Elementary Teachers Federation of Ontario. Go ahead, Shirley.
Thank you. Good afternoon, and thank you for inviting me to speak about education recovery. I have 17 years of education experience as an educator, and am now vice president of ETFO for the provincial office. We know that in its plans for a post-pandemic recovery, Ontario must consider the impact on already marginalized communities and invest in public services necessary to build a more just and equitable province. And those investments must include public education. The mental health of teachers, education workers, and students have been a concern and were evident even before the pandemic due to devastating cuts to public education, and it requires the province's urgent attention. A 2019 report from the People for Education on supporting students' mental health found that in elementary schools, only 23% have guidance counselors, 30% have regular access to psychologists, 48% have regular access to social workers, and 38% have regular access to child and youth workers. Our students shouldn't have to wait 6 months to 3 years to get access to services in our schools. Special education grants must be based on actual student needs, which are increasing, and funds should be increased for educational assistants, psychologists, behavior therapists, and other support personnel. Smaller class sizes will help provide stability and give students the attention they need going forward. So let's cap grade 4 to 8 in kindergarten at 24 and 26 students respectively. The use of hybrid learning by school boards in Ontario must end. It has led to students and educators facing unprecedented challenges and pressures, further compounding the ongoing mental health crisis. The government must also direct funding to the education sector and community organizations to eradicate anti-Black racism and all other forms of racism from Ontario's public education system. I know that there are other key elements needed for education recovery, and I know that many of us will share the same concerns. It is our hope that the province begins to allocate the necessary resources to undo the damage caused by years of funding cuts. Ontario students deserve a high quality, equitable, and inclusive public education system, and our members deserve the exact same. And I have to agree with Kathy, when we have healthy students and we have healthy workers, we have a very healthy education system. And I will stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Fantastic. Keith, have you been able to find what you needed to find?
I believe Keith is joined in as a phone caller, so there may have been some technical difficulties on his end, but Keith, can you hear us?
Oh, technology is so wonderful.
Love it when it works.
It's like, I'm going to go ahead with Julia, and then we'll go back to Keith. So the next person is Julia Candlish. She's the Director of Education of the Chiefs of Ontario. Thank you very much, Julia. Nice to see you.
Hi, very nice to see you too. Just for clarity, I just want everyone to know that I'm not speaking on behalf of the 133 First Nation communities in Ontario. That would require consent, which takes some time to obtain. However, what I can offer to this discussion are observations from my experience in coordinating and advocating for improvements in First Nations education in Ontario and across Canada. By way of context, the constitutional distribution of legislative powers in Canada results in two separate but often linked education systems for First Nation learners. Our learners derive supports from both federally and provincially funded education systems. In my personal view, both systems are riddled with colonial inequities that form gaps in the provision of meaningful education for First Nation learners. I refer to these as systemic gaps, and they tend to result in lagging attendance and graduation rates and a lack of advancement to post-secondary studies for First Nation learners. Although the list of inequities is long and fraught with a patchwork of short-term solutions, I'll focus my remarks on three essential areas that have likely been exacerbated by the harsh realities of the pandemic. Meaningful progress moving forward relies on using pandemic recovery as an opportunity for a reset and a refocus in the following areas. The first area is funding. Funding is often at the forefront of discussions on educational needs of our learners, and it's not always a complaint about lack of funding, although that surely is a problem, but often it's a lack of input on the use of funding, especially when it comes to funding received by district school boards to support our learners. This brings me to the next gap that I'd like to talk about, systemic gap, and that's relationships. Moving forward, educators in the public education system must expand their knowledge of the pre and post-pandemic realities for First Nations learners and plan for relationship building with First Nations students, families, and communities. Parental involvement contributes to student achievement and builds positive and trusting relationships with the students. The last area is addressing the digital divide, which has prevented First Nation learners from having equitable access to the technology needed for online learning. The lack of infrastructure and the shortage of teachers with expertise in information technology contributes to the digital exclusion of many Indigenous learners.
Thank you.
Thank
You're
you.
all being amazing. I think that Keith is now with us. Thank you so much, Julia. And there you are, Keith. Hi, Keith.
Hi, everyone. Sorry I'm late. I had to finish an exam, a final exam. um, could I just start anytime or?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Keith Baybayon. I'm a Toronto student trustee for the Toronto Catholic District School Board in my second year of my term, and also the president of the Ontario Student Trustees Association. I'll just get right into the whole presentation. So as a background, when the COVID-19 pandemic hit, the lives of billions were upended around the world. Massive systems, institutions were disrupted, and the Ontario public education system is no exception. Students brought out waves of invention and innovation from staff, schools, school boards, and a province attempting dozens of new local and provincial changes for the first time to adapt to the pandemic. Now that I'm speaking to you all today, I want to reiterate how it is crucial for all decision makers within public education to listen to students' experiences and feedback and to shape ongoing and upcoming plans accordingly. One major focus that OSSTF wanted to place upon was capping class sizes at 20 students. So education and schooling in Ontario have profoundly been disrupted by the COVID-19 pandemic. From March 14, 2020 to May 15, Ontario schools was closed for 20 weeks, longer than any Canadian province or territory. This closure affected many students because of the lack of in-person interaction and learning engagement with their teachers. And it is clear to acknowledge how troubling the learning environment has become for students after the continuous pivot to virtual from in-person learning. To combat this issue, funding must be allocated to the effort in reducing class sizes and maximizing it to a 20 of total. There are so many benefits to capping classes at 20, such as teachers being able to directly address diverse student needs, improving student behavior and peer relationships, and increasing engagement and achievement in students. Our journey for learning recovery must place the reduction of class sizes with greater importance as students have felt unheard within their virtual classrooms. Secondly, we wanted to focus upon disadvantaged students. So the crisis created by the pandemic must lead to a recovery that addresses inequity. The needs of students from disadvantaged socioeconomic backgrounds and those who are particularly affected by the crisis needs to be focused upon, because we believe that allocating funding towards supports for students from disadvantaged backgrounds are essential in our learning recovery. And these supports can include personal mentors, out-of-school tutors, increased access to mental health resources, and even free therapy. Resources should be aligned with needs and reflect the social and economic conditions of students and schools in a very transparent manner. That's how I like to end off. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much. That's fantastic. Now we have Jiwan Chanika, who's the Director of Education from the Waterloo Regional District School Board, Waterloo Region District School Board. Thanks.
Thank you for inviting me as we consider a foundation for an educational recovery action plan. Keep in mind that while we're addressing the COVID pandemic, we've always had a pandemic affecting Indigenous, Black, racialized, and marginalized students, those with special ed identifications to us LGBT plus students, and those coming from low SES. We've begun to make strategic investments in de-streaming in Waterloo region, and we need support to broaden how de-streaming is addressed to consider the following. Strategic early continued interventions in reading and math with the goal of having all students reading by the end of grade 1, and in math to support at the junior level in order to pave the pathway for de-stream mathematics later on. Additional supports for tutoring before and after school to support students, increased support for special education students targeted based on IEPs, considering modifications at grade level where appropriate. Recognizing that achievement and well-being are intricately connected, focus on placing supports that allow schools to be trauma-informed and support restorative approaches in addressing issues. Improve parent engagement through dedicated system navigators who support parents to navigate and engage, as well as supporting schools to build wraparound supports with community partners to help address literacy, mental health, and well-being. To support staff through targeted measured well-being strategies, addition of clinicians and social workers to support school staff in addressing mental health and well-being for students. In addition to this, focused hiring. Research clearly indicates the benefits of hiring students who have shared experiences with students and reflect the possibilities for success. These supports that I've identified are only a few, but they are research-based and they address all of the areas that the province has signaled through its upcoming board improvement and equity plan. They're targeted, focused, measurable, and accountable. They engage students, families, elders, community partners, and staff. They are holistic in their approach. At WRDSB, we've begun to make some of these strategic moves, but we definitely would benefit from having funding in place to help us go deeply to make the type of impact that will allow students to rise to their highest potential, recognizing that what is necessary for some is good for all.
Thank you very much. And now we have Chris Cowley, who's the president of the Ontario Teachers Federation.
Good afternoon, everyone. Happy to be here representing the Ontario Teachers Federation. The original agenda said 3 minutes, by the way. So, but anyways, that's okay. I'm gonna see some people are laughing, they know too. But I'm gonna got 3 items and I'll go through them as quickly as I can. The first thing I want to talk about is learning loss amongst students. I mean, you know, teachers have made a Herculean effort bouncing between in-person and online learning. They've done their best to make sure learning takes place. But students, especially our at-risk students, can fall through the cracks and are falling through the cracks, and learning loss can happen. So one of the things that, you know, we need to address this, of course, are teachers. And one of the things that we don't have more and more in this province are teachers, where there's a growing teacher shortage. You might have seen in the news recently, myself, along with the Minister of Education, signed an amendment to the teachers' pension plan to allow retired teachers to work more. But we've been clear, this won't solve the problem. We need more teachers in the pipeline to not only, you know, replace retiring teachers, but also to add to what I would like to see this money spent on is you know, specialized teachers that can address learning loss, that can work across the province, across schools, across the province, and deal with some of these most at risk and most areas of most need, you know, really. So I think that can be certainly part of the solution, are, you know, additional teachers, so we can fund more spaces in the faculties and get more teachers in the pipeline to address some of these needs. The second thing I'd like to talk about a little bit is, you know, meaningful teacher professional development that can, I think, can work, you know, in conjunction with a lot of the ideas that have already been presented. Financial literacy can be talked about, mathematics. We can focus on that learning loss piece, as well as addressing student mental health, teacher mental health, and the commitments of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Teachers want to do their part to meet the goals of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and meaningful professional development can help with that. Finally, I think we can, you know, push pause on EQAO testing. I don't think we need to put additional stresses on students' plates. I think we can redirect those funds to, like I said, addressing the learning loss that's taking place, identifying it. We don't need a standardized test to tell us that students are struggling. What we do need are additional teachers that can specialize to, you know, address some of these needs. So those are 3 things. I can talk as well about teacher mental health and staff mental health, which is absolutely essential. But I've got 7 seconds and I'll wrap it up there. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so much. And people are being fantastic at keeping time. And also it's really great because it's such an array of pitches and ideas. The next person to talk is Gary Fenn, who's the Director of Communications and Political Action for the Ontario Secondary School Teachers Federation. Go ahead, Gary.
Thank you very much. And
whoa. Okay, sorry. I thought you only had 1 second, so I was going to say change his clock. Okay.
No, thanks. No, it's good to see some familiar faces here, and thanks for inviting us to this session. I would propose that if we had $1.08 billion to dedicate toward this recovery in education, we need to invest that funding in providing the additional education workers and services that students desperately need. The disruption, the inconsistent shifts to remote and online learning have limited access for many students to supports that they've needed over the past few years and beyond. We know that students have had less immediate and direct access to many of the one-on-one services that school board employed personnel would normally provide. We say board employed personnel because of the strong and connection they make with students and the learning they are engaged in directly in the schools. Many students require assessments to determine the additional supports that they will need. Many students need the one-on-one support of an educational assistant. Many need access to mental health supports, which has been a theme we've heard a lot so far. Many require qualified board-employed staff working in schools to provide the immediate supports necessary to succeed and grow. These supports and services need to be available in a timely fashion to support the work of teachers in the classrooms, and will need to be accessible to all students, or we will witness the greater widening of the inequities we already see in the system. Many parents have and will continue to seek private options for these supports, and unless we invest in these supports and services for students in a meaningful way, we will see an expansion of the existing inequities in our system, or worse yet, greater privatization of Ontario's public school system, thus widening those inequities. I'll finish by drawing your attention to a Conference Board of Canada report published in June 2019 called The Economic Case for Investing in Education. In short, each dollar of public education spending generates $1.30 in total economic benefit to Ontario. At the same time, the inverse holds true for each dollar taken from public education. While our discussion is not primarily about economics, we do know that a strong investment in an equitable recovery in education will yield positive outcomes for students, families, and communities. If the government shortchanges that investment in education, then the effects will be felt across the province and all sectors and across all sectors, starting with the very people we need to support the most, and that's Ontario's students. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much. The next person to talk is Mahin Ghassemiani, who's the manager of social workers in schools at the London Cross-Cultural Learning Centre. Go ahead.
Hi, everyone. I am actually the manager of settlement worker in school. They are not a social worker. They are a settlement workers in school. And that being said, my focus is a little different than the rest of the topics that was discussed, a lot of policies and things. We work with the newcomers, and during the pandemic and prior to pandemic, we have noticed a lot of inequity when it's come to system navigation. They're looking at the language barrier, mental health, social connection, and also looking at the aspect of connecting not only the children, but the parents. The parents, if they are not healthy in a way that they are not able to connect with the school system, not able to connect and learn because of their own, some of them, they do not have literacy background from their own home country. So the language barrier is one. Coming from trauma and war torn is a second. Accessing the technology. I use an example of the system navigation when everything is online. Parent portal is online. And for a parent who doesn't speak the language, for the parents who doesn't know even how to use an email, expecting that as a system, as a service providers, they have to go and use the system. How would they be able to support their children, support their family? So right there, we see an inequity there, that we developing system that is not inclusive in a way. We doing as a system, we're trying best, but the way the population is, the way that Canadian society is changing, we have more diverse. Therefore, we have to look at the diversity and the need, whether it be learning, whether it be the language barrier, whether it be trauma. So we were focusing on having it with the school system that is more wrap-around model that support this individual, these students, that there are our futures. And if they are locked behind because of those barriers that put in place, not purposely, but the way that technology has moving forward, we have noticed prior to pandemic, now with the pandemic and recovery, access to technology has been a challenge. Having the parents to engage with their kids is a challenge. Social well-being is a challenge. So the more focus and money invest in this, it would be, I think, provide more successful resources and success engagement.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Fantastic. Scott Leatherdale is the professor of public health sciences at the University of Waterloo, and he is our next speaker.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm going to argue that we need to know what works for whom in what context, and this requires evidence. But with that, there are three challenges. First, in general, feasible, affordable, and effective evidence-based interventions don't currently exist. We also know that one-size-fits-all approaches to school-based prevention efforts or well-being promotion don't work. And we know that schools are often the innovators when it comes to developing new resources, but those resources aren't often rigorously evaluated so they can be implemented elsewhere. So my solution, and I guess I come across as a data wonk in this role, is that we need to create a learning system for Ontario that's designed to do 5 things. First, collect population level longitudinal data from Ontario students as they progress through school from K to 12. 2, we need to collect population level longitudinal data from schools about what they're actually doing with respect to their program, policy, and built environment resources they're providing to students annually. We need to evaluate the impact of these ongoing natural experiments as programs or policies or built environment resources change within schools annually, or provincially, or even within communities over time. We need to share that emerging practice-based evidence with stakeholders in real time where it's most likely to have an impact. And we also need to provide additional financial resources to the schools where it's most likely to have an impact. With respect to building off this solution, we know that a very successful prototype of this learning system already exists in Canada. It's been collecting data from over 75,000 kids since 2012 across Canada. It's in a large sample of Ontario schools already, and that's the work that myself and a team of 30 different researchers across Canada have been leading for the past decade, called COMPASS. For example, if we implemented the COMPASS system in Ontario as a learning system, it'd be quite feasible to collect population level data from all 4,900 schools and the approximately 2 million K to 12 kids annually. And this would cost roughly about $3 million a year, and the infrastructure to do this already exists. There'd be the ability to evaluate all the natural experiments as various programs or policies are changing across these schools annually. The infrastructure already exists to do this. It's about $2 million a year. The ability to share emerging practice-based evidence with relevant stakeholders also already exists for about $1 million a year. And then conservatively, even if we targeted schools with additional resources annually, save $10,000 per school year, that still fits in at around $49 million a year. So I don't think we necessarily need the $1.8 billion. This could easily be done for around $50 million. Thanks.
That usually never happens. Do it for less. Thank you very much. The next speaker is Lance Mccready, who is an associate professor at OSSTF and a director of the transitions program at U of T. Hi, Lance.
Hi. Yes, and I'm the director of the Transitional Year Program at University of Toronto, which is a university access program, one of the oldest in the country. So I'd like to start by saying just the equities, reiterate much of what everybody's been saying. The equity seeking groups that I work with most closely, Black youth, Black queer youth, were experiencing significant marginalization prior to the pandemic. So it's not as if the pandemic has created these marginalization and vulnerabilities, it's actually just exacerbated it more. For young people from racialized low-income immigrant backgrounds and who identify as LGBTQIA2S+ and are attending secondary schools, which is my focus, we need more investments put towards assessing the academic, social, and emotional education impacts of COVID. Of course, at this population level, it has to be disaggregated by race, class, immigration status, disability, gender, sexual orientation, etc. More generally, I'm arguing that we need a culturally responsive, sustaining, decolonizing education that humanizes and elevates historically marginalized voices. We need to center students' basic needs as well as affirm their cultural identities. We need to foster positive academic outcomes through additional supports, tutoring, and mentoring. We need to develop students' capacity actually to face fears of death and fragility of their bodies, to be able to connect across lines of difference. We need a culturally responsive, decolonizing, and sustaining education that contributes to individual student engagement, learning, and growth and achievement through the cultivation of critical thinking. We need to provide equitable technological and library access. And we need a focus on individuals, families, and communities with limited economic resources in general, who are marginalized by, again, by race, class, gender, sexual orientation, immigration status, etc. Let me sort of end by saying a sort of phrase from my sort of dissertation advisor, Carol Stack, who wrote a really important sort of policy paper about going beyond what are given as given. So I encourage us in this sort of policy discussion about education recovery to go beyond what are the givens of the givens that we have to make our decisions based on.
Thanks so much. That's a great frame for all of us as we go forward. I'm going to apologize for the first name here, Jonelle Morvan, who's the Superintendent of Education at the Conseil Scolaire de Nouvelle Ontario. I apologize for probably mispronouncing your first name. Go ahead.
That's fine. It's Jonelle. Bonjour.
Jonelle,
Hello.
okay.
Almost everyone would have a different view on what should be the key priorities in a post-COVID-19 world. However, we all can agree that COVID-19 has exposed the weaknesses of our education systems and has provided opportunities for new developments and new thinkings. My remarks today suppose the following three key assumptions. Today, we are dreaming. And I believe that if we are going to dream, we must dream big. I believe that education is the only great equalizer and the key to sustainable development. And I believe that systemic barriers in education have to be uprooted. We cannot be a system creating the inequities and also be the great equalizer. Though my remarks today will reflect more intimately what's going on in the French language system, I am convinced that the issues are the same in our whole education system. In my opinion, to achieve equitable educational recovery in Ontario, we have to address the following four issues: language acquisition and development, especially for French language students and English language learners; learning loss linked to poverty. We all know about the learning pods issues; aggravation of youth mental health issues; and the lack of long-term vision and planning. If I had $1.08 billion, I would propose three key initiatives: implement literacy and numeracy centers through public-private partnerships, devise a tangible teacher recruitment and retention strategy, foster collaboration and partnerships between different communities and the education system. As an executive in the school board, as a scholar, and as a doctoral candidate in school leadership, I am certainly preoccupied by what is awaiting us in the post-pandemic world. I am, however, encouraged by great initiatives like this one, where the Center for Leading Research in Education is leading the conversation. I am looking forward to contributing my experience and expertise to the thinking for a more equitable educational recovery in Ontario in the post-pandemic world. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Janelle. The next person to talk is Karen Mundy, who's a professor at OSSTF and the director of UNESCO's International Institute for Education Planning. Take it away, Karen.
Thanks and good evening, everybody. I'm here and it's late at night, so I hope I'll be cogent. I want to pitch to you one-on-one students through tutoring, one-on-one or small group tutoring. And I want to pitch this to you for three reasons. First of all, it works. Second of all, it's scalable. And third of all, we have good proof of concept that we can replicate. And first of all, in kids to overcome learning loss, if that's what you want to call it, or to play. It is especially.
Karen, do you want to turn your video off? We're losing a lot of your words. It's so nice to see your face, but we can't hear you.
I hope that works better. I'm not sure it will.
Yeah, it does. Karen, thanks.
Does it? Okay, very good. We also know that not only that it works from the scientific evidence and meta-analysis, we also know that it works in context. So we've seen it scaled up, one-on-one tutoring or small group supports, tutoring in many OECD countries during the pandemic. And it is having a very large effect in closing the gap, especially between marginalized and other students. Some people will say that it's an expensive proposition, and for that reason, it's not scalable. But we also know from experiments around the world during COVID that it's possible to scale up tutoring using low-cost methods, particularly by using recent graduates or volunteers, and that this can be highly effective not only in helping children to learn, but also in scaling skills among young adults. And so I think all of us will remember the failed youth corps suggestion made by our Prime Minister early on in the pandemic. To my mind, there is an opportunity in Canada. It has been experimented with at a very large scale now in the US to actually introduce a tutoring corps using federal skills dollars to help with a scaled up tutoring initiative. I just want to say that one of the issues raised by several here has been the lack of a teacher pipeline, a pipeline of young teachers. And I think the other great advantage of a tutoring program is that it's a sort of testing ground or a pipeline for further bringing in young people into the teaching profession. So it already exists. We have proof of concept. We know it's highly efficacious. We can do it at scale and at a reasonable cost. And if we do it well, I think we will go a long way towards closing gaps in learning that have emerged, especially for marginalized and underserved groups.
Thank you very much, Karen. That's fantastic. The next person to talk is Tony Pontes. Tony is the president of Ontario's Council of Directors of Education. Good afternoon, Tony.
Thank you, Annie. And I don't think I've had a promotion lately. I think I'm still the executive director, but I like president. It has a nice ring to it.
Yeah.
So good afternoon, bonjour. It's a pleasure to be here with you today. And I would argue that a civil society is measured by how it supports its weakest or neediest citizens. And so by extension, a government's commitment to its education and the education of its students should be measured by how it supports the most vulnerable or the most marginalized children and students. And there's a real commonality here in what everyone is talking about. What we know is that the pandemic and the remote learning has had its greatest negative impact on students and children from marginalized communities, including Black children, First Nations learners, New Canadians, and students living in poverty. And this includes students who have not developed critical reading skills by grade 2, and secondary students who have fallen behind in their credit accumulation, particularly in grade 9 and 10. And research has consistently shown that early years reading skills and credit accumulation in grade 9 and 10 are critical markers for student success. So what could this look like? Well, for elementary students, it would require additional staff for all elementary schools to implement a reading recovery or similar type of program that really focuses one-on-one support for students who are behind in their learning. And this will be for all grade 1 to 4 students, because we know that students have fallen even further behind when they were in grade 2 and 3 through the pandemic. Expanded tutoring programs focused on reading and writing after school and on Saturdays. And I like your thoughts there, Karen. And expanded summer learning programs to expand to 4 weeks and 4 hours a day. We already have them for 3 weeks, 3 hours a day, but they should be expanded. The demand is there. For secondary schools, additional staff to create smaller classes in grade 9 D-stream courses in English, geography, math, science, and French. Additional staff to run credit recovery and credit completion programs to get at the credit accumulation, and further, and additional graduation coaches to ensure that students in the 12% that are currently not graduating in 5 years do graduate. And for all students, funding for tech devices, Chromebooks, to make sure everyone who needs one has one. And with that, consistent, reliable internet service. I have many more. I'll throw out one last one, and that is eliminate the 2-year teacher program and make it 11 months, September to May or June. And you could increase the number of students that are available as teachers. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Tony, and I'm glad you liked your promotion. And the next person to talk is Nadine Trépanier-Bisson, who's the Director of Professional Services with the Ontario Principals Council.
Thanks very much. I appreciate you all having me here. So I'm going to focus on three aspects: innovation, innovative collaboration, job embedded supports, and diversified leadership. So through the pandemic, we've learned that we can change quickly. We can use technology effectively. We've increased our awareness of the urgent need to be better for all students in terms of anti-racism, anti-colonialism, and accessibility. But we've done it mostly in a top-down manner and within the constraints of an outdated education system. We need to move beyond a top-down approach to a place where we do things we've never done before. In my view, that can't happen without collaboration. Collaboration that occurs within the workday that brings together a diverse group of stakeholders and educators, including students. Collaboration that values the expertise of school staff. Collaboration that is ongoing, and most importantly, that places student success and well-being at the center. We can collaborate on a number of issues. Are there alternatives to current timetabling, to current grade level separations? Where are the opportunities for cross-curricular learning in K-12 education? What about how we engage students, how we assess them, how we include families and community voice in learning? We also need to provide supports for staff. If we want successful students, we need staff who feel successful and have the tools necessary to serve all students. That starts with changing mindsets through job-embedded learning opportunities that create and foster anti-oppressive, anti-colonial schools and classrooms. It means allowing them to work together within schools and across jurisdictions, allowing them to innovate, acknowledging the risks of success or failure, and the certainty of learning through new experiences. We also need to provide opportunities to individuals in all schools and district roles to lead, whether as positional leaders or otherwise. We need to seek out and develop leaders who are willing to learn, who can envision flourishing futures for all students, who manage complex diversity, who develop and use their agency for the greater good, who are advocates for all underserved students. We need to make space for a diversity of leaders willing to take risks and dare to try. Student-focused collaboration, job-embedded supports, and diversified leadership will allow leaders to take us into the future of education, where each student can develop as active members of their communities and continue efforts to shape a world where children and youth have equal access to education opportunities. Let's focus on integrating what is working well with new, innovative job opportunities for job-embedded collaboration and supports that create opportunities for leaders. That may mean we need to step aside and make space for others to lead, and also that we may need to come together across roles and jurisdictions as a model of collaboration to begin the conversations and advocate for change.
Thank you very, very much. I skipped a person in my alphabet here. Sorry about that, Vidya. So the next person to speak is Vidya Shaw. She is an assistant professor in leadership and education at York University. Go ahead, Vidya.
Thank you so much. I want to begin by saying that I'm not sure that a just recovery is enough. What if evidence-based, scalable, narrowly measurable goals that come back a little bit better are too limited in scope? I'm interested in what happens when we imagine possible futures in education, futures that are founded on radical interdependence, which shift us into thinking about ourselves as extensions of one another, which recognize that both systems of oppression and opportunities for liberation are deeply connected. These futures offer a different framing to the hyper-individualistic, fragmented, competitive models that infuse all our relations, institutions, and schools. With $1.8 billion, I believe that we need collective thinking and collective imagining and collective action on education systems that we have not yet seen. This means that we need paid consultants, creators, innovators from classrooms, both students and educators, communities, families, and the academy who are ready and able to plan, execute, and support school systems with both hospicing, as Vanessa Andriotti calls it, old systems, dismantling old systems that need to be given away to, and the recreation of new systems and structures that serve all. We might look, for example, to transformative justice as a way of responding to violence and harm without creating more violence and harm. This is a system that asks us to look at the root cause of the problem, and it asks us to think about what do we need to do at the root system so that this harm is no longer possible. See, students, families, educators have radically different experiences of our one-size-fits-all education system, because the one in one size has always been settler, white, straight, cis, Christian, able-bodied. Transformative justice means that every structure, every initiative, every pedagogical approach centers and attends to the root causes of injustice. So whether we're talking about mental health or math or parent engagement, it means that we take seriously the varied and intersectional realities and identities of students and families, and the larger socio-political contexts and systems in which we all live and learn. Without understanding this, seemingly progressive initiatives such as identity-based data collection and de-streaming can be ineffective at best and harmful to those most harmed by schooling at worst. Perhaps focusing on learning loss, on gaps, on readiness levels, and at-riskness are more harmful than helpful. It means that we need structures of accountability that are process-oriented, generative, and proactive, but we also need structures for healing and regeneration. It means that we need to acknowledge and redress our failures and the shame that those failures have caused, instead of only being moved to change because of a social media blitz, a human rights complaint, or pressure from families and communities that benefit from the status quo. And it also means that we need to understand care and wellness as collective, not individual. So in the context of education systems, this means, again, the dismantling of the very structures that pit students, schools, and communities against each other, EQAO and streaming, just to name two. But it also means that we value our collective interests and needs over self-interests, and that we create structures, restructured pathways, whether through hiring, whether through student pathways and school programming, that operate from a framework of communicate, care, and radical interdependence. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think it's really great that there's been such an array of practical, right now, long-term, visionary, change it all. It's really great. The next person to talk is Katherine Underwood, who's a professor at the School of Early Childhood Education at X University.
Thanks very much, Annie. We've switched the School of Early Childhood Studies, so that's where I'm from.
Okay.
That's right. I'll just, many of the points that have been raised are present in what I'm going to bring to the forefront here. But the first point I'd like to make is that we need to remember disabled children and their families. Disabled children and their families understand this concept that is being called learning loss today, school disruption, as well as cross-sectoral barriers and integration in a way that the rest of the society seems to be adjusting to in the last 2 years. This is the absolute norm for the lives of disabled children and their families. The pressures that have been described by many of you, specifically on racialized, low-income, colonized peoples, are exacerbated when their children are labeled as disabled and when they experience disability. I believe that centering disability and the lived experience of disabled children, rather than talking about special education and access to special education as a service, has the potential to address the deep racial, economic, class, and colonial inequality that has been exacerbated by the pandemic, but that has always been part of what we have experienced in schools here in this province. As I said, I'm from the School of Early Childhood Studies, so I think it's important that I also put a plug in here to have a deeper look at the early years. The early years has been poorly understood in the broad social discourse on closures and child development and learning loss. While the province has primarily directed that childcare services stay open through the pandemic, many childcare centers either could not stay open or shifted their service model to deliver service to fewer or a different group of children. Childcare is also just one service in the early years. Many other programs and services have been ignored and had long in-person closures or have not returned to in-person service at all. The pre-pandemic interest in the early years as a critical site of learning seems to be waning in favor of economic interests in care that serves the workforce. Finally, the last piece, and I think this has been mentioned, is we need to really think about the research methods that we're using and the evidence that we're using to make decisions. large-scale quantitative data is really important, but just enhancing that with qualitative interviews that animate what has already been collected does not get to the fact that we need to be asking questions that are informed by the everyday experiences of people who've been made vulnerable by the circumstances that we've all been affected by in our society. Thanks.
Thank you so much. This is the last person, I think, unless I've missed somebody on this list. Tracy Vaillancourt, who's the Canada Research Chair at the school-based mental health at the University of Ottawa. Welcome, Tracy. Tracy, you're muted.
There always has to be one person that's muted, and I'm glad it was me at the end.
Great.
It's nice to bookend this event. Amazing presentations, and I'm just going to basically repeat what Kathy Abraham has said, but and add a little bit. So I think we really need to reduce inequity, and I know that's a low-hanging fruit, but inequity undermines the work of educators. So it needs to be at the front of our thoughts all the time. We need to create a children's mental health national strategy, and that we need to do this in a context in which they're most easily accessible, which is in schools. This strategy needs to provide coordinated care across sectors in a step care framework across the full continuum of mental health support, spanning promotion, prevention, early intervention, and treatment. I'm going to say something innovative. Nobody said this. We need to invest in universal social emotional learning programs for children in the primary years. And we need to invest in training, but a little bit different training than what's been said in terms of teacher training. I think that we need to invest in training more social workers, psychologists, counselors, child and youth workers, because we won't be able to accomplish what we said with regards to mental health unless we have more capacity in this area. And increasing capacity in this area is going to require federal funding and provincial funding. It's very expensive to train these individuals, and we need more spaces open at universities. And that's it. So when you go last, you get to go quickly.
That's amazing. Thank you all so much. Now, hopefully it's not me. Good, it isn't me. I was going to say instructions for the breakout rooms. Definitely not my area of expertise. Apparently it's Kelly's. Great. Thank you. That was really, really amazing. I took millions of notes. I'm inspired as a People for Education person in our work, thinking about the future of public education. So now I'm going to turn it back over to Kelly. Guess what? We're ahead of schedule. That never happens. So that clock is really great. So Kelly, over to you.
Well, I also am like full to the brim of all that good listening, and I imagine others are too. So our number one instruction right now is that you should all take a break, get out of your chairs and walk around for 2 minutes, maybe 3. It is 4:03. We're like 7 minutes ahead of minute by minute schedule. So why don't we actually take until 4:10? When you come back, or maybe just before you go, Caitlin is supposed to be able to press a button right now and put you into pre-assigned breakout groups. And there's usually a few stragglers who need to be reassigned. And all you have to do is hit accept for your group. The goal with the breakout groups, there are 2 things. First of all, it's to let people talk in a less constrained way. We do have kind of big groups, but we hope that this will give a chance. As I was listening, part of my brain was just recording and listening and typing, but part of mine was like, what's an example of that? What do you mean by that? Can you tell me more about? So you should have that conversation about the questions that kind of bubbled out of you as you were listening, to try and better understand each other's ideas, to try and seek connections, all those things. The tangible outcome of the breakout group is to come out of it there with at least 3 things that you think are priorities for any action plan that you can bring back to the main session. And we are delighted. I think one of the things I forgot to say right at the beginning is this is our first event at the Center for Leading Research in Education, CLRiE. So we are delighted to have other members of CLRiE, other faculty associated with the center who've agreed to facilitate these discussions, and their job is to make sure you all come out with 3 points. They'll report back to the group, and then we'll have a plenary conversation. And again, the goal is to kind of come up with some advice to government from this diverse group of researchers and stakeholders. There's lots for us to work with. That is more than clear. So take a break. 4:10, come back. You should just be able to accept your way into a breakout room.
Okay.
And if that doesn't work, Caitlin's going to help. So see you at 4:10.
And keeping in mind students, staff, and the communities that we serve. Oh, wow, double recording. We also talked about the collaborative approach that is required for us to be able to address some of the challenges, specifically because financial resources are not infinite. And so there are some things that we may have to reconsider and how we're going to be going about addressing those realities. A significant consideration that we had as we were having our conversation was also, as we're thinking about our framing from this place, the type of language that we're using to ensure it doesn't further more harm. Katherine highlighted some of the often ableist language that that keeps on coming up in the way that we frame things, especially when we talk about things like mental health and illness, when we talk about special needs, when we talk about social emotional learning, like all those pieces that are often anchored in ableist ways of knowing. So those were some of the key areas there. I think we felt that there was a lot of specific strategies shared amongst all of the speakers that could fit in sort of those key areas, and those are the pieces where we would need collaboration to be able to kind of think through some of the real pieces where we would have to struggle around whether or not the structures actually ever worked, whether or not we need to start rethinking them altogether, so that we can provide the right supports just in time in a way that's context specific, and in a way that really upholds. I want to go back to one piece that, as we're doing this, that we keep making sure that we uphold the calls to action for truth and reconciliation to really support Indigenous students. Yeah.
So if I can, I just want to clarify, I think that I have this. So that what you're saying is that there were a lot of specific recommendations made by everybody in the group, but for your group, it was really important that they be viewed through these kind of from these 4 perspectives or whatever, in these 4 buckets: the truth and reconciliation, equity, well-being, and achievement, and that they be thought about in terms of students, staff, and the communities that you serve. That was the sort of overarching piece, and that it be worked on collaboratively, so that you didn't necessarily talk about, and it means doing this specific thing, but more that it was vital that those big picture things be.
Yeah, and I think what I would probably add to that is to say that to be mindful of the framing. So we had, for example, a conversation about how, the way ableism creeps into. We also talked about the idea of the gap and who's in the gap, and how that often leads to conversations that that focus on the communities of students who've been hurt by the system, using labeling like at risk and some of those other pieces, and that we shouldn't really be, talking about gaps. We should be talking about an education debt. That's the language from Gloria Ladson Billings. of kids who are hurt by the system and from the onset.
Great, thank you. Now, Artavan, are you reporting for your group?
Yes, so thank you for that, Jiwan. Our group, we came at it from different angles, given our range of kind of backgrounds. And so I think our umbrella things and themes and priorities, we were able to do it under 3 things. First one was mental health, a contextual approach, and access to support services holistically. So under this umbrella term, we mentioned we need a decolonized, trauma-informed support for the physical, social, emotional, and spiritual wellness of students, educators, and caregivers. So going beyond just the students to the larger family and the community unit. And particularly within that, we account for how systems of power interact with the individual and collective wellness. So it's not a kind of a neoliberal, just an individualistic lens of looking at mental health and spiritual and well-being. So that was all just our first point. I know it was 1 sentence, but ours was 1 paragraph. The next point is opportunity gaps and system accountabilities kind of going hand to hand, particularly with a focus on the minoritized experiences. This could be immigrants, racialized students. So I'll think about it from an intersectional lens. And then kind of really anchoring the 2 together is investing in people locally to really create and support transformative shifts, because the norm didn't work for everybody. So the rhetoric of going back to normal was not a great experience for everybody. And we really, towards the end, discussed how does data come into this picture? We obviously all agreed we need data, but how we enter to do that work, we had some different suggestions. And I think the takeaway was we need a little bit of more collaboration, that interdisciplinary lens, the qualitative and the quantitative, people from the different sectors, from settlement to psychology to education, really all being at the table, because at the root of all these issues are systemic nature of things, and we need to tackle them all simultaneously to have that turnover effect of being more equitable. Others, feel free to jump in. I try to encompass it to the best I could with all your helps.
Can I ask a clarifying question about that? When you talked about the opportunity gaps and system accountability, did you have it? Was there anything more? Were there things under that in terms of kind of specifics?
I think we just talked, we shared different examples that, for example, in education, when we talk about the achievement gap, the root causes of that is actually in things outside of education, like accessing social support services, accessing mental health services, helping navigating how to go from high school to post-secondary, being a newcomer or an immigrant. So we gave lots of examples of really, it's not just achieving, it's actually all the other things that impact motivation and engagement, and whether someone decides to stay in school or be engaged in it more holistically. Others, feel free to jump in from our group.
I think that was great, Artavan. And you know, this real piece around wraparound. Sorry, I'm trying to upload a piece that I wrote on opportunity gaps here. So I can't do 2 things at once, but the real sort of focus on wraparound services. Folks talked about the really putting things in place to support community building, to support parents as well. Yeah,
that's great. I can already see themes emerging. Danielle, no, Julie.
Thanks, Annie. So our group took, I feel like there was a bit of a research a feeling in the room. We spent a lot of time talking about the need for evidence and assessment, and in both short-term and long-term options, so that it is more about developing that research culture and ensuring that the data is collected, but we have to also address it immediately as well as long term. So ensuring that we take advantage or use the data that is currently available. And so whether that be from other districts where it has been collected, or whether we are able to pull in pots of feedback and experiences of people throughout the pandemic to respond, but then moving forward, ensure that we are able to collect that. So the research and assessment piece is one, ensuring that culture is created, and there's lots of critical discourse around what has happened and what's about to happen. The second piece we talked about was centered around teachers and the idea looking at whether short term, again, if we need to shorten the program. Thanks for that suggestion. Steve and I'll have lots of work to do in the next year if that happens. But certainly addressing the need for teachers and other options, ideas that included in that piece was not just teachers, but who's teaching the students, having volunteers, specific programs around literacy and numeracy, whether that happened in literacy centers, as Janelle suggested, but ensuring that the supports for the teacher role are there and that they're appropriate for every student. And our third piece talked more about collaborative work and the idea of an advisory panel taking education out of a silo. And I know the ministry approached this maybe 10 years ago when looking at putting the Ministry of Children's Services and Education together. I did go to an event much like this, talking about what stakeholders should be included and who needs to be around the table. And there was discussion about the political climate, the current political climate, and whether that would be something within politics or if it's outside, something like the research center, CLRiE's research center, where we are doing what we do today and pull in advisory from all stakeholders. So post-secondary institutions, research centers, professionals, students, families, ensuring that everybody has a voice at the table. So I think that were our three key points. And of course, I did mention, I think, didn't I, Annie, in the first mention that we need money to do that. Although Scott, or yes, in our group, yes,
Tony.
Scott.
No, Tony was one that,
Scott can do it for free, right? Is that right,
oh,
Scott?
right, yes, yeah.
Not free, but
I didn't say free, but cheap.
Good. And I hope that captured the discussion. It was very deep and hard to put into 280 characters or less, but I tried.
So I think that, I mean, so I'm sort of going to try and go, this is what I heard, but then ask people to now feed in terms of, because it seemed to me there was quite a bit of consensus across in terms of collaboration, especially in terms of thinking of this systemically rather than just inside education. How do you think about communities, about parents, about students, about all of the other kind of factors that go into where kids are? So that kind of cross-sector collaboration. There was discussions in our group and others I can see around that kind of wraparound idea and the intersections. So where do all these people come from? I mean, this time of day is not my best time of day. Where are the intersections in terms of where the issues are and where we need to be thinking? There was a lot of discussion, I think, in the big group and in most of the groups about research. Do we have the research? Do we have the evidence? And we did talk about, is there some way of having something that exists like this that's giving good, strong advice to government? But I guess now the job for all of you is to What else, if you were trying to either sum this up or thinking about all three different groups and what they said, are there other totally concrete, because in the end the CLRiE is going to develop a policy brief with very concrete recommendations to government. Are there things that were missed in this, or things that you want to add that are other concrete pieces to what was being said? And just either start talking or put up your hand. You can do either thing. I can see Artavan and then Kathy Abraham. Oh, I can see millions of hands. Great. Artavan.
For me, I think if, let's say, the next step is to make recommendations, I think we need to host a similar event, but it's open to the community. So we don't speak on behalf of them. Of course, you all are doing very authentic work, but maybe we're missing something here at this table. So I think it's important to have more of an open forum that is more accessible. And maybe we have to go to communities, because we know technology issue is an access for many communities, or given the pandemic, what's a priority right now. So I think if at some point we're making recommendations, we have to make sure we didn't lose voices in the process and we're more proactive. So that's just my point. Thank you.
Great. Kathy?
I would agree with that, but I would also say that we need to somewhere right in there that there has to be the ability to fit this to local communities. One of the things we talk about as a provincial organization is one size does not fit all. And we need to really recognize the importance of local impact and local fixes or whatever. It's not a good time of the day for me either, Annie.
Oh, I'm glad. I'm just like, oh God. You should ask my family what I'm like at this time of day. Vidya?
I would just add as well that I think that I think we absolutely have to go to community and communities and make it local. I love that idea too, Kathy. I'm also thinking about more students. I think about this has impacted them the most, and we need to really be centering student voices here in terms of how this is impacted and what they need right now. I think oftentimes we look to adults to tell students what students need instead of just asking the students directly. There's that piece. And I'm also thinking about, as we think about this notion of investing in people, I just want to go back to this idea that boards and teachers are going to need support again in this transition. So there has to be the mental health and wellness support for educators as well in this time. Every person I speak to, every educator that I speak to is falling apart right now. And they're not allowed to say it because they get in trouble, but they're falling apart. And so there has to be, as part of that people support, centering the wellness of educators, so that they can center the wellness of students.
Thanks, Vidya. I know that we suddenly got massive participation in our annual Ontario School Survey, and the stories from schools are actually heartbreaking. They're about incredible bravery, and we're doing this and we're going to make it work, but at a huge cost. So I think that is a good point. Julie, you have your hand up.
Yes, I'd just like to build on that. My point was what we're missing is really the growth mindset, and I know it's a crisis, and it has been for several years. But I'm also talking to teachers who are, like you said, Annie, making it work, but are also finding the joy and the inquisitive and the curiosity of their students. And that needs to be celebrated, and not just celebrated, but built on and used as something to talk about other than COVID and every problem that creates. I think a lot of that is what's putting pressure on teachers, instead of saying, like we had a pandemic before the pandemic. If you look at childhood obesity and sedentary rates, and we need that. The piece that's missing is that happy feeling, the testosterone, the physical health and activity of children, of adults, and it's just been dismissed as we don't have time for it. And I think it's really important that we keep that mindset too, that there are good things happening and we have strengths to build on. And in terms of, yes, we need to find where the problems are and reimagine, but holding on to what is working too.
Thank you, Julie. And Shirley?
So I know that this has been said before, but I think it's worth saying again, as we're talking about imagining a different system and looking at things differently and doing things differently and supporting educators and boards around how to do that. We need time to do that. There has to be built into their proposal that's being created needs to be time to adjust, to change, to as the previous speaker used the growth mindset, just to change how we're thinking. And that time has to actually be built into the proposal in order to make it meaningful.
That's great. Thank you. And Janelle?
Thank you, Annie. I think that one thing that I have not heard is the idea of public-private partnerships. Throughout the pandemics, I think that a lot of people have become richer and richer. A lot of corporations have become richer and richer. And we are used to look at governments to fund educational change. But I think that we need to think about public-private partnerships in order to use resources available to support our education system. I think somebody talked about the Conference Board of Canada and some of the big institutions that we have in Canada. I think that in the States, it's something big, but we have to look at things differently here in Canada too.
That's great. I see Amin Ali, who I didn't see before. Hi, Amin, you have your hand up.
Yes. Hi, Annie. It's nice to see you. So I brought this up in our group and I want to bring it up writ large. I think there's a particular type of student who's at risk of falling behind here, and it's going to be racialized immigrant first-generation students. And the reason for that is that the real value of school, and I've realized this as a university student now, is education's opportunity to build social and cultural capital. And on Zoom, you don't get that. You don't get that because you need to be in person, in the flesh, having social interactions to do it. And I worry there's going to be a whole generation of immigrant first-generation kids in Toronto who are going to see their trajectories, their transitions to post-secondary totally derailed because they didn't have the opportunity to build that social and cultural capital, find mentors, often racialized teachers doing unpaid emotional labor, to be that invisible support and that transition to post-secondary. And you're going to see them potentially lose access. If this pandemic happened maybe a decade ago when I was in the system, I'm thinking how I would have turned out, because would my parents have had the cultural capital to navigate Twitter, talking with teachers so much over email and different things, and just knowing the lingo around back to school? I'm not sure. Like in the pandemic, I supported them with booking vaccines, medical grade masks. Like I support them with kind of just media literacy and kind of just the awareness around some of the pandemic issues. And there's other immigrant parents out there. I wonder how they would manage that. And so that's a big consideration. And I had one more thought on that.
Just a second. So, I mean, because we're trying to make recommendations. So how do you solve that? So when you I think you've identified an incredibly important piece that we don't recognize in a way as what's part of what happens in that in-person relationship. But is there something then going forward that comes out of the, noting the issue?
What really helped me actually in high school is being a student trustee. I'm going to look at that as one of the formative experiences, how I met you and people for education. It gave me an opportunity to really gain that cultural capital, to gain that socialization, to learn how to be in professional spaces. And had I not had that early on, I don't know what trajectory might have ultimately been. And so I think the solution for that is pushing work integrated learning, paid co-ops in high school, expanded professional things like that.
Great. I'm going to keep going just because I'm watching the time now. So Jiwan, you had your hand up, and then Nadine, I think, is who I can see. Thanks a lot. I mean.
Thanks. One of the things that I just wanted to note when we talk about the well-being of staff, that we make sure that we keep it broad to all staff, not only educators. Right now, it's a huge challenge at every level of the organization. And so I call our educators the other set of frontline workers that people don't want to acknowledge as frontline workers. So anybody in school, we're seeing it with custodians, we're seeing it with EACYWs, we're seeing it with other support staff. So I think, in a very sort of practical way, thinking about in the following year and years, what does the school calendar need to look like? How do we build in opportunities around well-being that are structured and paid for that would allow us to be able to support a lot of the adults who are trying to support children to be able to address the trauma that they have had to endure. What does that look like for things like potentially keeping students back a grade with their families in support, if that is what they would deem as a necessary sort of next step. There's a lot of research that speaks to what Amin was talking about around the capital that we need to help students build to be able to access things. The one sort of caveat that I have in my mind is just the current political landscape and some of the realities that may bring forward for us as we're trying to do this work. And so the other piece that I'm thinking about is how we keep the way we respond authentic and honest, but maybe consider that reality as well. Because like I will tell you as a director, we're finding out everything the same time as everybody else. And in fact, sometimes we're reading it. And I will say that even at the highest level of the organization, people are like, I'm holding people together. And some days I can't even hold myself together. And these are experienced people. These are not people who just started a year ago. So we're really, really struggling and we're getting hit from every side.
Thank you. So, and I can see, and it's that notion of time and space too, rather than just how do we kind of keep going, that Shirley talked about too. Nadine, you have your hand up.
I think Lance has had his hand up for a really long time and hasn't had.
I'm so sorry.
So I'm happy to have Lance go first, and then I will come in after.
You know what, Lance? It's because your background has so many other things in it that yes. Anyway, that's my excuse. I'm going to stick with it. Go ahead, Lance, and you're muted.
Okay. Just quickly, I just want to. I mentioned this in the my breakout group. I really think that we need sort of incentives, funds directed to really bring our families and our teachers and everyone back to schools. I think schools have been cast as these sort of places that are sort of the cesspools of COVID. I think there's a lot of culture of staying away from schools, and I think that's going to be really detrimental to students sort of engaging more with teachers and educators. We need to think of schools more as hubs. We need to sort of make there be much less bureaucracy for those programs and services that are meeting our families' basic needs, our children's basic needs, everything from after school, again, to settlement. We have to, this is not the time when we need to have our schools throwing up mounds of paperwork that actually end up keeping those programs and services out. We need to sort of streamline that, make it much more easier for those programs and services that are meeting those needs to happen. Also, we need to sort of more funds directed to food and just providing meals for our students and families to be able to work. And I also think in our teacher education programs, maybe shorten our principal preparation. We have to have these teachers and leaders really feel like that they are also members of and agents of the community. They have to work with our community members. They have to be oriented to that early on. They cannot see sort of schools as sort of the island or something that's out to be separated from the community. And so I think that's going to be important and crucial for us to get our families sort of trusting in sort of schools as places for education and as optimal learning environments again, and not as these places that we need to stay away from in order to sort of improve the health and safety of their families.
Thank you. Nadine.
Thanks. I just want, we've touched on a lot of things, and I think one of the pieces for me, and I'm wearing my OPC hat, obviously, is that, I think most of us in this group are positional leaders, either within our organizations, with programs, school boards, schools, we're positional leaders of sorts, right? And so who are our other leaders? Who are those leaders who are not in positions of leadership, and how can they help us to bring forward this change and to define this change? And then that's part one. And then part two is, how do we better develop leaders, and how do we promote those leaders who are those people who haven't envisioned themselves as leaders, but who really, we know they are, they just don't see themselves as leaders, as positional leaders. How do we promote those people? How do we work with them to bring their voices forward? And then how do we redefine leadership development in our boards? I think those are really important pieces that we need to look at this. If we want good school systems moving forward, we need to figure out how we support those who are leading positionally, but also those who are leading and who are not in positions of leadership, because those people are really important in our schools and in our systems, and we can't forget about them.
Thank you. I'm trying to imagine the summing up of all this, and I'm looking at the time, so it's 25 past 5. Keith, you have your hand. Is there anybody else that I'm not seeing who has heard that? But I think Keith is the last person that I can see. So Keith, you go for it. And then I'm going to wrap it up, and then I'm going to hand it over to, or I'm not, I'm sort of wrap it up and hand it over to Steve.
Yep,
go for it,
sure.
Keith.
When you make these sort of recommendations, like in the near future, you have to ask yourself, how are you engaging the student voice? Are you only asking one group of students, like from the same city, or are you actually and just calling it a day? Or are you making an effort to get student voices from one area of the province and then getting perspectives from students at the other side of the province? When I see someone like high up in a system and say that they're grateful to have met with students, like on their Twitter or their Instagram, and it's just students from the same community with no diversity, no representation of other communities, especially those of racialized, it honestly damages our feeling of being heard, a feeling of being heard at the student level. Because engaging students is crucial when you make decisions that affect their education as a whole. And when you reach out to students themselves, you need to ensure you're giving them a space to tell their stories. Distributing surveys with the goal of acquiring statistics isn't enough to make meaningful recommendations, in my personal opinion. Like, you need to listen to their experiences, because a student's experience can differ from school to school and even from board to board. One prominent aspect that OSSTF pursued last year was a document called The Volume of Our Voices. So this was a document that included actual stories, like literal quotations that we asked for students to provide, because they included actual stories, their voices, their experiences of students, which brought forth recommendations that tackle the issues that they have within the education system. And as a whole summary of this whole thing is that making the effort to include student voice is one thing, but implementing these voices to the project itself is what matters most. So really taking the student voice, but utilizing it at the project level, especially through the recommendations that you may write up.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Keith. And it's interesting because Lance in our group talked about how we're trying to get kids to invest more time. So in these discussions about tutoring, about mentorship, about programs inside and outside school, and he asked, so what are our wellness strategies to get kids to want to invest more time? So where are we kind of starting? I think that this group who's going to create this policy brief has its work cut out for us, for them. I can't tell you, even though it's this time of day, it's really, really wonderful to listen to all of you and to know that there are so many people out there trying to make this work, trying to make a change work, trying to figure out how we move forward. I love the idea that everybody needs time and recognition of the kind of stress they've been under, rather than, and now we're going to add 20 more suggestions about what needs to be done. But I'm going to hand it over to, this is me not doing my job summing it up. But I think there's consensus underlying all of this, that then everybody will have to go through all of the notes to find, okay, this is what we think you said. And then you're going to have to ask everybody if it was indeed what they said. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Steve.
I liked when you said the statement, Annie, about us working through this rather than
I
them.
changed it after.
So thanks so much, everyone. I'll just wrap up in 2 minutes. My name is Steve. I'm the director of the research center that has supported today's session. I'm also a researcher on inclusion and school leadership in relationship to disabled students. This talk and the various panel presentations were very meaningful to me, and I was on the edge of my seat with wanting to make some comments, but I'll reserve them till now. I hope you enjoyed the opportunity to meet together today. To me, it felt like a little bit like a combination of think tank and of a think tank and Dragon's Den at times. So great to have those pitches and to have the really great conversations in the breakout sessions. I regularly challenge my students in the Faculty of Education to think about the so what, now what, and that's where I'm going to wrap up as far as as we consider priorities for equitable educational recovery. So if I think about the so what, our focus today has been on equity, on education, and on recovery. And it's reminding us that no recovery plan can happen without being completely immersed and centered in an equity framework, with students being at the very center of that framework. So it's not an opportunity just to consider recovery and then think, okay, how do we ensure this is equitable, or to add an equity lens after we've determined the action steps. Instead, we have to begin with begin any action with a constant reminder that students are at the center of what we do. And as a result, equity for all students has to be the starting point, the framing point for all action. And certainly these kinds of discussions can be difficult. I'm reminded of Bell Hooks, who in Teaching to Transgress described a class who was resistant to learn, and to quote Hooks, who did not want to learn new pedagogical processes, who did not want to be in a classroom that differed in any way from the norm. To these students, transgressing boundaries was frightening. So we're in a situation where transgressing boundaries needs to occur in order to ensure equitable educational recovery occurs in Ontario, yet perhaps frightening and challenging, but absolutely necessary. So our mission at the Research Center at CLRiE is to be a leader in interdisciplinary research and knowledge mobilization related to education in a changing world. So today's panel has given us the so what, and CLRiE members, all 70 plus members of the center want to engage with that. We're researchers, faculty members, family members, school system leaders, grad students, administrators in post-secondary contexts, teachers. But we're people united in a desire to stimulate educational research and make that research accessible. So the now what is we need to translate the why and the what into the how, and how can we work disruptively and collaboratively going forward to ensure that this is not just a discussion, but an action with students at the center. So a tangible now what, as Annie has said, is that we will focus on the development of a framework, a policy brief that we will develop and distribute, which can serve as a roadmap for going forward. Perhaps we'll give it a fancy name, like CLRiE Manifesto or CLRiE Framework for Action, but we'll certainly aim to host a follow-up event with a broader audience. That was mentioned a number of times, and I think that's just excellent advice. Last thought, Henri Giroux and Peter McLaren in their book, Between Borders, talk about the importance of combining theory and pedagogy to challenge who gets what in education. And Hooks in one of the last sections of Teaching to Transgress makes this statement. I want to leave you with this. It's crucial that critical thinkers who want to change our teaching practices talk to one another, collaborate in a discussion that crosses boundaries, and create a space for intervention. So may today's panel be a reflection of the legacy of Hooks, of Bell Hooks, and the fostering of discussion, collaboration, and space making with students and equity at the center. Thank you again for being with us today. We will hang out, so to speak, for as long as anyone will want to stick around. But again, thank you, and we look forward to being back in touch with you once we have a written statement and some ideas of further steps. Kelly, Caitlin, thank you for the fantastic work both of you have done. As any of you can imagine, any kind of event like this, especially I think we started planning for this in mid-December, is pretty remarkable. And Kelly deserves an incredible amount of credit for that. And Caitlin, as our research associate, has just been the backbone providing the support. So thank you to both of you and to my fellow CLRiE executive members who've joined us today for supporting this. Have a great evening, everyone.
Steve, does it seem like more of a grant-seeking endeavor now?
We'll have Artaban get on top of that. He seems to be the grant-seeking person these days.
Grant guru.
If I have a quick question, and before I go, well, more of a wondering, I guess, is a lot of us seem to have speaking notes, or we actually read our prepared notes, but some people had some speaking notes. I wonder if it would be interesting for you guys to collect those, because you could probably do some kind, upload them into some kind of system and do a qualitative analysis of those speaking notes that might actually generate some interesting ideas, and compare that to what people said in their summary notes to what our speaking notes actually come up with in terms of some of those key perspectives. So I just had that wondering. So I'm just going to throw that out there and leave it for you guys. But you know, I know that like I had written something out, and so as I was listening to people, I could see that a lot of us had at very least speaking notes, and that may be sure, yeah, send it directly. Absolutely. So I just had that wondering as I was reflecting and listening to all the wonderful pieces, but that may just be another piece or another way to capture some of the information. So I'm just going to leave that with you guys.
Thanks, Nadine. Appreciate that. It's a great idea.
All right. Thanks. Have a good evening, everyone.
Thank you, Nadine. You too. Well, thanks, everyone. And enjoy the evening. Kelly, Caitlin, I'm sure we'll touch base about just a debrief. Eileen, Alexandra, Julie, and we're missing Danielle and Rochelle here from the CLRiE executive, but would love your input on how that went with your insights. But again, and Marine, I see that you're still here as well. So maybe do you have another question or a suggestion for us?
Me?
Yes.
Oh. My question was, it's not really a question. I felt that it was very informative for me, that I'm not a researcher, which you guys are, and wanted to thank you for actually inviting CCLC to be part of that, because I think the voices of the newcomers in a different level is vital. And as we all know, the newcomers are coming from different level of education, different level of need, and the need is different. Yes, so one size does not fit all. And my note was mostly focused on those that has low literacy and also have high need. For sure want to say that the technology or virtual service was beneficial to many during the COVID, but we have a population that are usually forgotten or missed between the cracks, because it's not something that every day we are working with those individuals. And I have noticed from my experience that there are those families that are facing the challenge, and in turn the children who are the student of the school are facing the challenge, and they are the one that paying the bigger price as well. And keeping in mind that this need is huge, and it is important for the policymakers, researchers to also tap into that. That's one thing that I just wanted to say thank you.
Oh, that's fantastic. Really. And I think Artavan has made a comment, in case you haven't seen it in the chat. Your voice was very, very valued in this discussion. You raised some real excellent points. So thank you for being part of it.
Thank you all for having us here, and good luck.
Thank you.
Keep us in touch. Thank you.
Yeah.
Enjoy your evening, all of you.
Thanks. You too.
Yep, bye.